You are such a naughty boy.
Come on, you know about that?
Simba, everybody knows about that.
Really?
Oh, yeah. Simba's down there.
Simba?
If it weren't for you, he'd still be alive.
For buzzards!
Get some F. Alrighty, what do we got here? Bumper, are you nuts? You're talking about a lion. Lions eat guys like us.
But he's so little.
He's gonna
He'll be on our side.
That's the stupidest thing I ever heard. Maybe exactly. Jeez, I'm fried. Let's get out of here and find some shit. You okay, kid?
I guess so.
You nearly died.
I saved you. Well, Pumbaa helped. A little. No. I mean, he's depressed.
Kid, what's eating you?
Nothing. He's at the top of the food chain. Where you from?
Who cares? I can't go back.
Ah, you're an outcast. That's great. So are we.
What'd you do, kid? Hakuna Matata. It means no worries.
Hakuna McGee's.
It's our problem-free philosophy.
Hakuna Matata.
Every time that
Hey, Pumbaa! Not in front of the kids.
Oh, sorry.
The Lion King begins by placing certainty before us. The Pride Lands are introduced not as a puzzle to solve, but as an ordered world with a clear center, a clear hierarchy, and a clear expectation about who belongs where. Simba enters that structure before he has earned anything within it. His importance is inherited, publicly recognized, and treated as natural by almost everyone around him. That initial position matters, because the film asks us to accept his centrality, long before it asks us to examine what that centrality requires. For film perspective media, that is the first useful imbalance in The Lion King from 1994. Simba knows far less about the meaning of power than the world around him appears to assume. Yet the story gives him the emotional privilege of being our main point of access. We encounter the kingdom largely through the excitement, curiosity, fear, and confidence of someone who has been told that the future already has a place prepared for him. That alignment makes Simba easy to understand. His early fascination with becoming king is not framed as political ambition in an adult sense. It feels closer to a child imagining freedom, status, and importance without understanding the obligations attached to any of them. The film keeps us close enough to that innocence that the gaps in his understanding initially feel harmless. What he cannot yet see, the audience is encouraged not to judge too severely. Mufasa complicates that position without immediately breaking it. He represents authority, but the film does not present authority only through commands. His presence gives Simba access to a larger interpretation of kingship, one based on limits, balance, and responsibility. The crucial difference is that Simba hears those ideas before he is capable of fully inhabiting them. Knowledge is available, but maturity is not. Scar stands outside that emotional arrangement. He understands hierarchy far more strategically than Simba does, yet the movie keeps us at a different distance from him. His intelligence is visible, but his inner world is not offered with the same warmth or innocence. From the beginning, then, the Lion King distributes sympathy unevenly. One character receives intimacy before understanding. Another receives suspicion alongside understanding. That distinction quietly shapes everything that follows. The obvious way to see the film is as Simba's movement toward a destiny that always belonged to him. But the more revealing perspective is that the story gradually tests whether belonging is enough. The young prince begins inside a world that tells him who he is. The deeper journey begins when that certainty can no longer protect him. The central contrast in The Lion King is not simply between courage and fear, or even between Simba and Scar. It is between two different ways of understanding what it means to occupy a place of importance. One treats position as something inherited, almost as if identity arrives fully formed with birth. The other treats position as an obligation that has to be accepted, understood, and acted upon. That difference is the perspective axis of the film, inherited privilege versus chosen responsibility. At first, Simba experiences kingship almost entirely from the first side of that divide. The title belongs to his future before he has done anything to deserve it. His curiosity about becoming king is therefore shaped by certainty. The kingdom appears to be waiting for him. His imagination focuses on freedom, recognition, and control, because those are the visible rewards of authority to a child standing outside its actual demands. The film aligns us closely enough with him that this misunderstanding feels natural rather than immediately selfish. That is important. If Simba were presented from a colder distance, his confidence could look arrogant. Instead, the movie filters his ambition through youth, playfulness, and incomplete knowledge. We are encouraged to understand the gap before judging it. Mufasa introduces the alternative perspective. His authority is not defined only by being obeyed. What matters is the way he connects leadership to limits. Simba is gradually shown that power does not mean unrestricted freedom, and that being at the center of a system also means being accountable to what surrounds that center. This is where the film's perspective thesis begins to emerge. The Lion King initially gives Simba a protected sense of belonging, then gradually removes the conditions that made belonging feel automatic. As his access to certainty changes, the meaning of kingship changes with it. What first looks like a destination becomes a responsibility. Scar offers another version of the same problem. He understands status as possession. From his position, authority is valuable because it changes who commands, who receives attention, and who defines the order of the kingdom. The contrast with Mufasa is therefore not merely moral, it is perspectival. Both recognize that power matters, but they interpret what power is for in fundamentally different ways. Simba begins between those interpretations without fully understanding either one. That is why audience position matters so much here. The film does not ask us to begin with a mature definition of leadership and then watch Simba prove it. Instead, it lets us occupy his incomplete understanding first. We feel the attraction of certainty before we experience the cost of losing it. As that certainty weakens, earlier ideas begin to look different. Confidence can become naivety, freedom can become avoidance. Destiny can begin to sound less like entitlement and more like a demand that has not yet been answered. The Lion King's most important shift, then, is not from childhood to adulthood in the simplest sense. It is from being told who you are to deciding what that identity requires from you. The film's emotional power depends on keeping us close to Simba while steadily changing the meaning of the position he thinks is already his. The Lion King initially gives Mufasa the strongest claim over the world we are seeing, even though Simba is the character whose emotional experience gradually becomes central. That distinction matters. Mufasa owns the kingdom in a political sense, but he also owns the frame in a narrative sense because his presence establishes what order looks like before Simba is capable of defining it for himself. When Mufasa appears, other characters respond to him as a fixed point. His authority is built through posture, placement, reaction, and the way surrounding characters orient themselves toward him. He rarely needs to demonstrate power through constant force because the world already acknowledges it. The film therefore presents leadership first as something visible in relationships. Mufasa's position is confirmed by how others behave around him. Simba occupies a different kind of center. The camera and story repeatedly follow his curiosity, but his social position is still dependent on his father. He receives access without authority. He can enter spaces, ask questions, and imagine the future because he is protected by an existing structure that he did not create. That creates an important gap between dramatic centrality and actual power. Simba may be the character we follow most closely, but he does not yet control the meaning of what he sees. When he looks across the Pride Lands, he sees possibility. Mufasa sees responsibility. The same landscape therefore carries two different interpretations, depending on whose understanding organizes it. The film uses this difference carefully. Simba's perspective makes the kingdom feel immediate and exciting, while Mufasa's presence introduces boundaries that Simba cannot yet appreciate. The audience is close enough to Simba to share his fascination, but not so restricted to him that we completely inherit his misunderstanding. We are allowed to recognize that the world is larger than his interpretation of it. Scar is positioned differently again. He belongs to the royal structure, but he is repeatedly separated from its emotional center. His scenes often emphasize enclosure, shadow, or physical distance from the open spaces associated with Mufasa's authority. The important point is not that visual darkness automatically means moral corruption. It is that the film gives Scar a different relationship to the kingdom. He observes its hierarchy from a position of resentment rather than stewardship. That distance also affects how much access we receive to him. We are allowed to understand that he wants power, but the film does not invite us to inhabit his grievance with the same emotional closeness it gives Simba's uncertainty. Scar can explain, manipulate, and calculate, yet the viewer is kept outside the vulnerable interiority that might complicate those actions. This asymmetry is deliberate storytelling. Mufasa is granted legitimacy through the world's response to him. Simba is granted sympathy through proximity. Scar is granted intelligence without comparable emotional identification. Those three positions create the early architecture of the film. Even supporting characters reinforce it. Zazu's concern with rules helps preserve the existing order. Rafiki occupies a more ceremonial and interpretive position, appearing less interested in everyday authority than in continuity and meaning. The animals gathered around Pride Rock turn leadership into something publicly witnessed rather than privately claimed. The kingdom, in other words, is not presented as neutral territory. Every major character enters it from a different level of access. This is why Simba's inheritance initially feels so secure. The film surrounds him with visual and social confirmation. He does not simply believe he will become king. Almost every structure around him tells him that his future has already been recognized. But recognition is not the same as readiness. By placing Simba emotionally near the center while keeping actual authority with Mufasa, the Lion King creates a useful tension. We see the world through someone who is important before he understands why importance carries weight. That tension prepares the story for a much harsher change in perspective. Once the authority organizing Simba's world is no longer guaranteed, the frame cannot remain stable. The question of who defines reality will become far more dangerous because the position that once seemed permanent will prove capable of being taken, distorted, and rewritten. The Lion King builds much of its early tension through a simple inequality of knowledge. Simba is usually the last important character to understand what is really happening around him. He is central to the future of the Pride Lands, but that importance does not give him greater access to information. In fact, his innocence makes him easier to guide, flatter, frighten, and mislead. Scar benefits most from that imbalance. The audience is allowed to recognize his hostility toward Mufasa and his interest in the throne long before Simba can imagine him as a threat. That creates a form of dramatic separation between what Simba believes and what we are permitted to suspect. We remain emotionally aligned with Simba, but informationally we are sometimes placed outside him. That difference is crucial because it stops his early mistakes from being presented as simple foolishness. Simba does not make decisions with the same knowledge the viewer has. He moves through a world in which family status creates an assumption of safety. Scar understands that assumption and exploits it. The film therefore makes trust itself part of perspective. To Simba, Scar is not initially an unknown outsider. He is part of the family structure Simba has been taught to regard as stable. The audience, however, receives access to Scar in situations where Simba is absent. We see enough of his resentment and calculation to know that the family relationship is not emotionally reciprocal. This produces tension without requiring mystery. The question is not primarily whether Scar can be trusted. The viewer is given strong reasons not to trust him. The more important question becomes what Simba will do while operating from incomplete information. Mufasa creates a very different informational relationship. When he teaches Simba about the kingdom, he expands his son's understanding rather than narrowing it for personal advantage. Yet even Mufasa cannot simply transfer maturity through explanation. Simba can hear ideas about responsibility, limits, and the interconnected nature of the kingdom without fully understanding their consequences. The distinction between receiving information and comprehending it becomes one of the film's quietest strengths. Simba often possesses the words or concepts necessary to behave more responsibly before he possesses the experience required to understand their weight. From his perspective, warnings can look like restrictions. Boundaries can appear to be obstacles placed between him and independence. The film keeps us close to that youthful interpretation while simultaneously giving us enough broader context to see what Simba cannot. That dual access allows the Lion King to avoid locking the audience completely inside one character's consciousness. We understand Simba, but we are not limited to Simba. We understand Mufasa's authority partly because we see how others respond to him. We understand Scar's danger because the film gives us scenes and reactions unavailable to Simba. We understand the larger structure of the Pride Lands because the story repeatedly moves beyond what Simba himself can observe. This makes the film's focalization flexible. Simba remains the emotional center, yet the audience sometimes knows more than he does. The result is an unusual combination of intimacy and distance. We can experience his confidence while recognizing its vulnerability. The difference becomes particularly important when Scar manipulates Simba's understanding of cause and responsibility. Scar's power does not come only from physical or political ambition. It comes from controlling the explanation available to someone who is frightened and unprepared to question it. At that point, information becomes a form of authority. Whoever can define what happened can influence what Simba believes about himself. and because Simba has not yet developed a stable identity independent of the structures around him. The explanation he receives carries enormous emotional force. This is where the film's handling of knowledge becomes more psychologically important than its simple division between hero and villain. Scar does not merely want Simba removed from a position of succession. He benefits from making Simba interpret himself through a damaging version of events. The manipulation works because the story has already established how dependent Simba is on trusted authority for understanding the world. The audience is placed in a painful position. We can recognize that Simba's interpretation is distorted, while also understanding why he accepts it. Knowledge does not automatically give us power to correct him. That helplessness changes our relationship with the protagonist. Earlier, knowing more than Simba could make his impulsiveness seem amusing or predictable. Now the same informational gap becomes dangerous. The viewer's superior knowledge no longer provides comfortable distance. It makes Simba's vulnerability clearer. The Lion King uses this shift to transform information from background exposition into a central mechanism of alignment. What matters is not simply what the audience knows, but when we know it, who remains excluded from it, and how that exclusion changes judgment. Simba's greatest weakness at this stage is therefore not ignorance by itself. It is that he does not yet know how to evaluate the stories other people tell him about who he is. And once someone else successfully defines that identity for him, the film's perspective is ready to change much more dramatically. The first major shift in The Lion King occurs when Simba's protected relationship with the world collapses. Until this point, danger has existed around him, but it has existed inside a structure that still feels fundamentally secure. Mufasa's authority, the stability of Pride Rock, and Simba's own place in the royal family create the impression that mistakes can be corrected because someone stronger and wiser remains nearby. The goat sequence changes that assumption. What matters most is not simply that the story becomes darker. The film alters the viewer's position by taking away the authority through which Simba has understood almost everything. Mufasa has functioned as father, protector, teacher, and evidence that the kingdom possesses a reliable order. When that presence is removed, Simba does not merely lose someone he loves. He loses the person who had been interpreting the world for him. The audience experiences this change differently from Simba because we already know more than he does. We understand that the catastrophe is connected to Scar's intentions. Simba does not. That informational difference makes the aftermath more painful than a conventional surprise would be. We are watching a frightened child attempt to explain an event with fewer facts than the viewer possesses. The performance and staging narrow the emotional field accordingly. Simba's earlier energy depended on movement, curiosity, and the expectation that the world would respond to him. After the catastrophe, that confidence disappears. The film allows stillness, hesitation, and physical smallness to replace the expansive assurance associated with his earlier scenes. His position inside the image has changed before his formal status has even been discussed. This is the first time the movie fully exposes how dependent Simba's identity has been on external confirmation. Earlier, being Mufasa's son seemed almost inseparable from being Simba. The future king, the adventurous cub, the protected child, and the heir to Pride Rock all existed inside the same stable identity. Now those pieces separate. Scar takes advantage of that separation by offering Simba an explanation at the exact moment Simba is least prepared to evaluate it. This is where the earlier information imbalance becomes decisive. Simba does not simply receive bad advice. He receives a version of himself from someone he still has reason to treat as an adult authority. The viewer therefore begins judging Simba from a different position. His earlier recklessness can no longer be treated only as youthful comedy. The consequences surrounding him make that confidence look more fragile in retrospect. But the film also prevents us from reducing what happens to a simple punishment for disobedience. Simba's mistakes matter, yet the audience knows that his understanding of responsibility is being deliberately distorted. That distinction protects the film from making guilt identical to accountability. Simba feels responsible because he has been given a false interpretation of events. The audience can recognize that his guilt is excessive, while still seeing that the experience will eventually force him to confront what responsibility actually means. This is the beginning of the film's deeper redefinition of kingship. Before the shift, Simba imagines adulthood as increased freedom. After it, adulthood begins to acquire another meaning. Living with consequences, uncertainty, memory, and decisions that cannot be undone simply because one wishes to escape them. The formal geography changes with him. Pride Rock and the Open Kingdom had represented belonging because Simba's relationship to those spaces was secure. Once he leaves that environment, distance becomes psychological as well as physical. Home is no longer merely a place from which he is absent. It becomes a place connected to an identity he can no longer comfortably inhabit. That makes the transition away from the Pride Lands more than a plot relocation. The story is changing who has authority over Simba's self-understanding. Mufasa once defined responsibility through guidance. Scar now defines Simba through guilt. Soon Simba will encounter another way of seeing himself. One that offers relief precisely because it asks less of him. The important point is that the film does not move directly from innocence to maturity. It moves from innocence into avoidance. That middle position is essential. If Simba immediately understood the truth, accepted responsibility, and returned with a mature sense of purpose, the film's argument about identity would become mechanical. Instead, the first shift leaves him without a stable framework. He knows what he has lost, but he does not yet know how to interpret the loss. This also changes the audience's emotional alignment. We are no longer merely observing the child who misunderstands authority. We are watching someone whose entire sense of belonging has been damaged by an explanation he cannot properly test. The obvious perspective at the beginning was that Simba's future had already been decided. After this shift, nothing feels decided. His inheritance still exists in principle, but psychologically it has become inaccessible. The title that once seemed like a promise now carries associations of failure and pain. The same future can no longer mean what it meant before. That is the film's first true reframe. The question is no longer whether Simba will eventually receive what belongs to him. The more important issue is whether he can become capable of returning to an identity he has learned to fear. Once Simba leaves the Pride Lands, the Lion King changes not only his location, but the emotional distance between the character and the responsibility attached to him. The film gives him a new environment where he can become more comfortable precisely because the parts of himself connected to duty are no longer being demanded. That comfort is appealing, but the perspective becomes more complicated because relief and avoidance begin to occupy the same space. Timon and Pumbaa provide something Simba has been missing: acceptance without interrogation. They do not require him to explain his past before allowing him into their lives. From Simba's position, this is liberating. The identity that had become associated with guilt can be left unspoken, and the future that once seemed predetermined can be replaced by immediate companionship. The film moves closer to Simba emotionally during this period, while keeping important parts of him at a distance. We can see that he becomes more relaxed. His posture, movement, and interaction with his new friends communicate a version of Simba, less burdened by the fear that defined his departure. Yet the film does not give us full access to how deeply the past continues to affect him. Instead of constant confession or explanatory monologue, it allows avoidance to appear through what he does not discuss. That withholding matters. A character can be emotionally available without being psychologically transparent. Simba jokes, participates, and forms genuine attachments, but the most painful part of his identity remains compartmentalized. The audience knows that the silence contains more than simple forgetfulness. We have seen where he came from, what he believes happened, and why returning would threaten the protective story he has constructed around his new life. The distance becomes clearest when the past enters the present through Nala. Her arrival changes Simba's emotional position because she knows the identity he has been avoiding. Timon and Pumbaa know the person Simba has chosen to become. Nala knows the person connected to Pride Rock, Mufasa, and the responsibilities Simba has tried to place outside his current life. The contrast is not simply between old friends and new friends. It is between two forms of recognition. Timon and Pumbaa recognize Simba without demanding continuity with his past. Nala recognizes him through continuity. Her presence quietly insists that the earlier version of Simba has not disappeared simply because he stopped inhabiting the place where that identity mattered. This creates a more complicated kind of intimacy. Simba is physically close to Nala and emotionally connected to her, yet he initially resists the perspective she brings with her. The film allows the audience to feel the attraction of reunion while also noticing the discomfort underneath it. Affection does not automatically produce honesty. That is where performance becomes central to alignment. Simba's reactions reveal hesitation before he fully articulates it. Confidence returns easily when the conversation stays inside the life he has built. The moment it approaches home, responsibility, or the condition of the Pride Lands, that ease becomes unstable. The audience is therefore invited to remain sympathetic without accepting his position uncritically. This distinction is important because The Lion King does not frame avoidance as cruelty. Simba is not indifferent to suffering simply because he refuses to return immediately. His resistance grows from the identity he has accepted about himself. Returning home would force him to approach the guilt he has spent years keeping at a manageable distance. From his viewpoint, staying away can still feel like the safer moral choice. From Nala's viewpoint, staying away has consequences for everyone who remain behind. The scene between them therefore becomes a conflict of perspective before it becomes a conflict of action. Simba sees return through memory and shame. Nala sees it through need and responsibility. Both are responding to realities the other has not fully inhabited. That is why the film's emotional alignment becomes less comfortable here. Earlier, sympathy and identification mostly pointed in the same direction. We understood Simba because we followed his experience. Now understanding him does not require agreeing with him. The film allows the viewer to hold two positions at once. His fear is comprehensible, and his refusal is increasingly difficult to defend. This is one of the strongest signs of Simba's transition toward adulthood. The movie stops protecting him from moral complexity. He is no longer merely the child who did not know enough. He has become someone whose choices affect people beyond the emotional boundaries of his own survival. The film keeps us close enough to feel why he hesitates while creating enough distance for us to recognize that hesitation has a cost. That balance prevents the character from becoming either a simple coward or an effortless hero. Simba's return must mean more than physical movement. It requires closing the gap between the identity he presents to others and the identity he has refused to examine for himself. Until he does that, the film keeps part of him deliberately out of reach. We can see the adult Simba clearly. We can enjoy his friendships. We can understand the refuge he has built. But the person capable of accepting responsibility is still being held at a distance, even from Simba himself. The central blind spot in The Lion King grows from Simba's belief that distance can contain consequence. Once he leaves the Pride Lands, he behaves as though the past has become a sealed part of his life. The new environment supports that interpretation because almost everything around him is disconnected from the political and emotional responsibilities he abandoned. The film temporarily allows the audience to live inside that same limitation. For a significant stretch, the Pride Lands recede from immediate view. We remain with Simba's new friendships, new routines, and growing ability to function without confronting what happened before. Because the story follows his emotional recovery more closely than the kingdom he left behind. Absence begins to feel almost like suspension. But nothing has actually stopped. That is the blind spot. Simba experiences exile as a private decision, while the consequences of his absence are collective. He understands leaving through shame, fear, and self-protection. Characters who remain in the Pride Lands experience the same absence through instability, loss, and deteriorating leadership. Those perspectives do not carry equal information. Simba knows almost nothing about what has happened under Scar's rule because avoiding home also means avoiding knowledge. His distance protects him from painful memory, but it also removes the evidence that might challenge his decision to stay away. The film makes that limitation character-based rather than presenting it as simple ignorance. Simba could not know everything happening elsewhere. And the story does not treat physical absence as a moral failure by itself. The problem is that he has built an identity around not needing to know. The worldview that gives him peace depends on narrowing the range of consequences he is willing to consider. Timon and Pumbaa's philosophy fits this need perfectly. It offers Simba a way of understanding life without constant reference to obligation, history, or inherited expectations. For them, that attitude has its own context and charm. For Simba, however, it becomes more complicated because he is using it to avoid a responsibility that affects others. The same idea therefore means different things depending on who occupies it. That distinction prevents the film from reducing Simba's new life to a mistake. His friendship with Timon and Pumbaa is real. The affection is real. The relief is real. What becomes unstable is the assumption that personal healing can permanently remain separate from unfinished responsibility. Nala's return exposes that blind spot because she brings information from outside Simba's chosen field of vision. She knows what his absence has meant to those who remained. Her perspective interrupts the version of reality Simba has been able to maintain because it reconnects his private decision to public consequences. The important shift is not simply that she tells him conditions are bad. Her presence demonstrates that Simba's understanding of his own life has been incomplete. He has been judging the morality of returning almost entirely through what returning would mean for him. It would mean facing pain, guilt, memory, and the identity he abandoned. Nala forces another perspective into that calculation. What does not returning mean for everyone else? That question destabilizes the protective logic of exile. There is also a broader limitation in the way the film presents the kingdom. The Pride Lands are simplified into a highly legible moral environment. Healthy leadership and damaged leadership are reflected visibly in the condition of the land. This gives the story clarity, but it also compresses complicated social and ecological systems into a symbolic relationship between ruler and kingdom. That simplification is useful to the film's perspective, though it can also narrow it. The story is more interested in Simba's moral awakening than in examining governance as a complex political process. We understand the Pride Lands primarily through what they mean for Simba's responsibility. Other inhabitants rarely receive the same depth of independent interiority. That is a structural blind spot rather than necessarily a plot hole. The film chooses to organize the kingdom around Simba's journey, and that choice gives the story emotional efficiency while limiting how fully other perspectives can exist outside his arc. By the time Simba begins recognizing what he has refused to see, the meaning of distance has changed. Distance once looked like freedom from the past. Now it begins to look like a filter that has protected him from information. The blind spot is therefore not simply that Simba left home. It is that he mistook not seeing the consequences for being free of them. Once that misunderstanding becomes impossible to maintain, the question of power returns with greater urgency. Simba must confront not only who currently controls the Pride Lands, but who has been allowed to define what reality looks like while he has been absent. Power in The Lion King is never only about who sits at Pride Rock. It determines whose version of reality becomes normal. Once Scar takes control, the kingdom does not simply receive a new ruler. It receives a new center of authority, and that change affects what can be said, what can be challenged, and whose experience matters. Earlier, Mufasa's power was presented through stability. Other characters recognized his authority without the film needing to show constant enforcement. His position seemed secure because the social world around him largely agreed that it was legitimate. That agreement gave his words weight. Scar's authority operates differently. He gains the position, but the film does not give him the same kind of legitimacy. His role depends much more heavily on control, fear, and the absence of credible opposition. The distinction matters because power can command behavior without commanding trust. The viewer is encouraged to notice that difference. Scar can occupy the same physical place Mufasa once occupied, yet the meaning of that place changes around him. Pride Rock no longer automatically represents order simply because a king stands upon it. The film separates position from worthiness. This is an important development in Simba's perspective as well. As a child, Simba often treated kingship as if possessing the title would naturally produce authority. Scar becomes evidence that possession alone proves very little. A throne can be taken, a title can be claimed, others can be forced to respond to power. None of that guarantees stewardship. This recontextualizes Simba's earlier enthusiasm for becoming king. What once sounded like a fantasy of freedom now looks incomplete, because the film has shown what authority becomes when obligation disappears from it. Scar's control of information is part of that transformation. The characters living under him have fewer ways to define the situation independently. His version of events has had time to become embedded in the political structure, because Simba, the person whose existence could challenge that version, has been absent. That absence gives Scar more than territory. It gives him narrative control. As long as Simba remains away, Scar's claim faces no direct contradiction from the figure most capable of destabilizing it. The kingdom therefore exists under both political and informational imbalance. Nala's departure from that environment becomes especially important because it allows another account of reality to reach Simba. Until then, Simba has been living inside a perspective shaped by distance. Scar has been ruling inside a perspective shaped by control. Nala crosses between those two worlds. Her knowledge makes the separation impossible to preserve. This changes the meaning of Simba's potential return. He is not being asked simply to reclaim something stolen from him. He is being asked to decide whether his personal fear should continue determining what kind of power everyone else must live under. That is a much harder moral position. The film does not erase Simba's vulnerability simply because the stakes have widened. His hesitation still makes psychological sense. But the more he learns about conditions at home, the less neutral his absence becomes. Knowledge changes responsibility. Once Simba understands that other characters are living with the consequences of Scar's authority, staying away can no longer be interpreted only as self-protection. It becomes a decision with political and relational effects. This is where the film's original perspective axis becomes sharper. Inherited privilege is not enough to justify Simba's return. If the story argued only that Simba deserves power because he was born first in line, then the difference between him and Scar would remain surprisingly thin. Both would ultimately be competing over possession. Instead, the film increasingly defines Simba's claim to what he is willing to accept responsibility for. That shift also changes how Mufasa's earlier teachings appear. They are no longer simply lessons from a wise father placed in the opening act. They become a standard against which different uses of authority can be judged. Scar treats the kingdom as something that validates his status. Mufasa treated his status as something that created duties toward the kingdom. Simba has experienced both ideas without fully choosing between them. His final movement toward leadership therefore requires more than defeating an opponent. It requires deciding which interpretation of power he is willing to inhabit. The film makes this visible through relationships. Under healthy authority, characters speak and move with relative security. Under Scar, reaction becomes more cautious, resistance more dangerous, and loyalty more fractured. Power alters not only large events, but the emotional atmosphere in which everyone else must exist. This is why the kingdom's deterioration matters beyond symbolism. It tells us that leadership has changed the conditions through which characters experience daily life. Power has changed the view. For Simba, that realization is decisive because it breaks the illusion that kingship concerns only his identity. The role is connected to other lives whether he wants the connection or not. He can reject the title personally. He cannot make the consequences of that rejection disappear. By this point, the question of who deserves authority is becoming less important than what authority is for. And once the film reaches that distinction, Simba's return can no longer mean recovering a childhood promise. It has to mean accepting responsibility for a world that does not exist solely to confirm who he is. The moral structure of The Lion King becomes more interesting once the film stops allowing responsibility and guilt to mean the same thing. For much of Simba's life away from the Pride Lands, he behaves as though returning home would require accepting a version of himself he cannot bear. His private judgment is severe. He believes the past has already decided what kind of person he is, and that belief makes avoidance feel less like cowardice than self-exile. The audience has more information than Simba does, so we are never asked to accept that judgment completely. That creates an important moral distance. We can understand why Simba feels guilty without agreeing that the guilt accurately describes his responsibility. The distinction matters because the film's eventual argument depends on separating what happened to Simba from what Simba chooses to do after understanding it more clearly. Scar benefits from collapsing those categories. His manipulation encourages Simba to interpret tragedy as proof of personal unworthiness. Once Simba accepts that interpretation, he becomes easier to remove, not only physically but morally. He does not simply leave the kingdom. He comes to believe that leaving is what someone like him deserves to do. That is a powerful way of controlling another person's perspective. The moral question therefore changes as the film progresses. At first, Simba's mistakes are judged through childhood. He is impulsive, eager to prove himself, and not yet capable of measuring consequences with adult clarity. The film permits criticism of those choices without treating them as evidence that he is fundamentally corrupt. Later, however, the conditions are different. The adult Simba knows more. Nala's account of the Pride Lands expands his understanding of what his absence means. The possibility of returning becomes real. At this stage, continuing to avoid the problem carries a different moral weight because his access to information has changed. The Lion King is careful here. It does not suggest that fear disappears simply because duty becomes visible. Simba's reluctance remains emotionally credible. What changes is the film's willingness to let that reluctance remain morally sufficient. Understanding a decision is not the same as endorsing it. That becomes one of the story's most mature distinctions. Nala's position helps sharpen it. From her perspective, Simba's return is not an abstract question of personal healing. She has lived inside the consequences of Scar's rule. Her urgency comes from conditions Simba has not had to witness directly. This means the film temporarily divides sympathy. We remain emotionally close to Simba because we understand the source of his resistance. At the same time, Nala is given enough legitimacy that his refusal cannot simply be accepted because it protects him from pain. The story invites judgment, then complicates it with context. Mufasa's memory adds another layer. Simba's relationship with his father has been shaped by admiration, loss, and shame. But the deeper moral function of that relationship is not to demand flawless obedience. It is to reconnect identity with obligation. The important lesson is not that Simba must become an imitation of Mufasa. It is that the values associated with Mufasa only matter if Simba chooses to act on them under conditions Mufasa can no longer control for him. This shifts morality away from inheritance. Being Mufasa's son does not make Simba good. Being the rightful heir does not automatically make him worthy. The film gradually places moral value in what he does once he can no longer rely on innocence, protection, or ignorance. Scar provides the opposite example. His grievance about status may be understandable as resentment, but the film does not treat understanding the source of resentment as equivalent to excusing the way he uses power. Context can explain a position without neutralizing its consequences. That prevents the film's moral complexity from becoming moral equivalence. Different characters have different wounds, limitations, and forms of knowledge. Those differences matter. But the story still distinguishes between authority used as stewardship and authority used primarily for possession and control. Simba's eventual decision therefore has moral significance because it involves accepting a burden he had learned to associate with pain. Returning does not erase his fear. It changes what he is willing to let fear decide. That is the deeper moral lens of The Lion King. The film begins in a world where identity looks inherited and wrongdoing appears easy to divide between hero and villain. As Simba grows, the harder question becomes whether a person can act responsibly while carrying shame, uncertainty, and imperfect knowledge. The answer the film moves toward is not that the past stops mattering. It is that the past does not have to retain exclusive authority over the present. Once Simba understands that distinction, moral judgment changes again. His worth can no longer be measured only by what happened when he was powerless and misinformed. It has to be measured by what he chooses when he finally sees more clearly. The Lion King does not simply tell us how Simba's understanding changes. It changes the conditions under which we experience the world with him. Early in the film, space feels open, ordered, and legible. The Pride Lands are introduced through broad visual relationships that make hierarchy easy to understand. Pride Rock dominates the environment. The kingdom stretches outward from it, and Simba's place within that structure appears secure. The geography itself helps turn belonging into something that feels obvious. That clarity is important, because the film later withdraws it. When Simba's world becomes unstable, the visual language becomes less reassuring. The spaces associated with danger feel narrower, more fragmented, or harder to control. The gorge is especially important because it reverses the openness associated with Mufasa's kingdom. Simba is no longer positioned within a landscape he can comfortably read. He is enclosed by forces larger than his understanding. The change in scale affects our alignment. Earlier, Simba could appear small without seeming powerless because the world around him was protective. During moments of crisis, smallness means something different. The environment no longer confirms that he belongs at the center of events. It exposes how little control he actually has. Editing reinforces that loss of certainty. The film frequently shifts between Simba's limited experience and information he does not possess. This allows the audience to recognize danger before he does. We are emotionally tied to his vulnerability while being granted enough additional access to understand why that vulnerability exists. That combination produces tension through unequal knowledge, rather than simple surprise. Sound also changes the viewer's position. The film's musical sequences often make Simba's early world feel expansive and emotionally direct. Song, movement, and environment work together to turn his confidence into something we temporarily inhabit with him. His ambitions can feel larger than their implications, because the form itself carries us through his excitement. Later, quieter moments work differently. When Simba is confronted by memory or responsibility, the film does not always need constant verbal explanation. Pauses, changes in vocal tone, and the reduction of playful energy create room for emotional resistance to become visible. The audience is asked to notice what Simba cannot easily say, rather than being given complete access to exposition. That restraint matters because Simba's conflict is partly about avoidance. If the film translated every internal struggle into explicit explanation, there would be less distance between the character and his own buried fears. Instead, form sometimes lets us sense the pressure before Simba fully acknowledges it. The contrast between environments also shapes perception. The world Simba builds with Timon and Pumbaa feels detached from the formal responsibilities of Pride Rock. Its lighter rhythms and relaxed social atmosphere support his belief that identity can be reconstructed without reference to the past. The space does not challenge him because it does not contain the institutions, relationships, and memories that once defined him. When the Pride Lands return to the story, the difference is immediately meaningful. Home no longer appears simply as the majestic territory of Simba's childhood. It has become evidence. The condition of the kingdom gives visual form to the consequences he has avoided seeing. What was once a backdrop for inheritance becomes a measure of responsibility. The film therefore uses image and sound to alter access, not merely to decorate the story. Open space can mean security in one section and exposure in another. Silence can mean peace in one context and avoidance in another. Familiar places can change moral meaning because the character returning to them possesses different knowledge. That is the formal strength of the Lion King's perspective. The film teaches us how to read its world one way, then changes the emotional information attached to the same kinds of images. By the time Simba is forced to reconsider who he is, the audience has already experienced that transformation through space, rhythm, scale, and sound. The kingdom looks different because Simba can no longer see it from the protected position of childhood. And once the form has changed our access in that way, the story is ready for its fullest reframe. The moment when the past, Simba's guilt, Scar's version of events, and the meaning of kingship can finally be reconsidered together. The full reframe of The Lion King begins when Simba finally confronts the difference between what happened and what he has believed happened. For most of his adult life, those two things have been fused together. He carries the conviction that Mufasa's death defines him because Scar successfully turned a traumatic event into a personal verdict. Simba does not merely remember loss. He remembers himself as the cause of that loss. That belief has controlled almost every major choice since his departure. It explains why exile felt necessary. It explains why returning felt impossible. It explains why his new life could offer genuine happiness while still depending on a carefully protected absence. Simba could live, grow, and form relationships, but only by keeping one interpretation of his past untouched. The final act forces that interpretation open. Rafiki's role becomes important because he does not solve Simba's problem by providing political information. Nala has already done that. Simba knows the Pride lands need him. What he still lacks is a way to understand himself that is not organized entirely by shame. The encounter with Mufasa's memory changes that position. The significance of the moment is not that Simba receives permission to forget what happened. The opposite is closer to the truth. He is pushed to understand that continuing to define himself through guilt is also a form of forgetting, because it reduces his relationship with Mufasa to one catastrophic event. Mufasa represented more than the circumstances of his death. He represented a way of thinking about responsibility, continuity, and the place an individual occupies within something larger. Simba has spent years preserving the pain of losing his father while distancing himself from the values his father tried to teach him. The reframe is therefore subtle. Remembering Mufasa cannot mean remaining trapped in the moment of loss. It has to mean recovering the part of that relationship capable of guiding action in the present. That distinction finally weakens Scar's authority over Simba's self-image. Scar's manipulation worked because Simba treated guilt as evidence. If he felt responsible, then he assumed he must be responsible in the way Scar described. Once Simba begins separating emotional truth from factual truth, the story opens a path back to agency. He can still regret his childhood actions. He can still recognize that he was impulsive and vulnerable to manipulation. But those admissions are different from accepting a false version of the event itself. This prepares the return to Pride Rock. The physical journey home now carries a different meaning from the future Simba imagined as a child. Earlier, becoming king meant arriving at a role already prepared for him. Now returning means entering a damaged place without certainty that inheritance alone can repair it. That difference resolves the perspective axis. Simba was born into privilege. He becomes worthy of leadership only when he chooses responsibility. The final confrontation with Scar tests whether that distinction will hold. At first, Scar attempts to regain control through the same mechanism that worked years earlier, interpretation. He tries to position Simba not simply as an opponent, but as someone morally disqualified by the past. This is important because Scar understands that defeating Simba psychologically may be easier than defeating him politically. Simba's old guilt briefly makes that possible. The past has returned, but at first Simba still approaches it through Scar's framework. This is where the film's long information imbalance finally collapses. Scar reveals enough of the truth for Simba to understand that Mufasa's death was not the event he had been taught to believe it was. The change is immediate, not because a hidden twist suddenly makes Simba innocent in every respect, but because the central story controlling his identity loses its authority. An earlier sequence is now reinterpreted completely. What Simba remembered as proof of his own failure becomes evidence of Scar's manipulation. What looked like exile chosen because of guilt becomes exile engineered through deception. What seemed like Simba abandoning a position he had morally forfeited becomes the result of someone deliberately removing a vulnerable heir. The revelation also changes our understanding of Scar's power. He did not rule only because he took physical control after Mufasa's death. His success depended on controlling who knew what had happened and on ensuring that the one person capable of challenging his legitimacy believed himself unworthy of returning. Political power and narrative power were connected from the beginning. Once the narrative collapses, the political structure becomes much harder to sustain. Simba's confrontation with Scar therefore carries more than revenge. If the film reduced the ending to revenge, its perspective on leadership would narrow considerably. The stronger reading is that Simba is reclaiming the ability to define himself outside Scar's version of the past. That does not make the climax morally simple. The confrontation is still fueled by anger, grief, and years of manipulation. But Simba's return has already placed him in a different moral position from Scar. Scar wants authority as possession. Simba has returned because he accepts obligation. That is why simply occupying Pride Rock cannot resolve the story. The film also has to restore the relationship between ruler and kingdom. Scar's reign is visually associated with deterioration and imbalance. The final restoration reverses that condition, but the important reframe is not that nature magically proves Simba deserves power. It is that the film returns to the relationship between leadership and stewardship established much earlier through Mufasa. The landscape once introduced Simba to inheritance. Now it reflects responsibility. The same place means something different because Simba does. This also changes the meaning of the early scenes with Mufasa. At first, they can appear to function as simple preparation for Simba's future kingship, a father teaching a son how to inherit his role. After the ending, those scenes look less like instructions for succession and more like a standard Simba repeatedly fails, avoids, and eventually chooses to approach on his own terms. That matters because imitation would not be enough. Simba cannot restore the past exactly as it was. Mufasa is gone. Childhood is gone. The security associated with the earlier Pride lands cannot simply be recreated by placing Simba where his father once stood. Leadership now exists after loss. That gives the final position more weight than the opening one. The young Simba stood at the center because the kingdom expected him to. The adult Simba returns after learning he can refuse, disappear, and construct another life. Responsibility becomes meaningful precisely because it is no longer automatic. Nala's role also looks different after the reframe. She is not simply the character who reminds Simba where he belongs. She represents the perspective of those who had to live with consequences while Simba remained absent. Her experience challenges the idea that Simba's story is only about personal identity. When he returns, he is responding not only to memory but to information he initially resisted because it required him to see beyond his own pain. Timon and Pumbaa are reframed as well. Their influence is easy to oversimplify as pure avoidance, but the ending shows why that would be unfair. They helped Simba survive and gave him a form of belonging when he believed he had none. The limitation was not their friendship. It was Simba's use of that life as a permanent barrier against unfinished responsibility. Once he chooses to return, those relationships do not have to be rejected. His identity becomes larger rather than narrower. This is one of the film's most useful conclusions. Growing into responsibility does not require erasing the self that existed during escape. Simba does not need to become a replica of Mufasa, abandon everyone who helped him, or deny that exile changed him. He has to integrate those experiences into a more complete understanding of himself. The final restoration therefore resolves several competing ways of seeing Simba. He is no longer only the prince born to inherit. He is no longer only the child manipulated into shame. He is no longer only the adult who found safety by refusing the past. Each version remains part of him, but none is sufficient alone. The ending also clarifies what the film leaves interpretive. It confirms that Scar manipulated Simba, and that Simba's guilt was based on a false understanding of Mufasa's death. It confirms that Simba chooses to return, oppose Scar, and accept leadership. It clearly presents that decision as a restoration of legitimate order. What remains more open is how fully Simba has resolved the emotional consequences of everything that happened. The film gives him action before it gives him exhaustive psychological closure. That choice fits the perspective argument. Simba does not have to become free of grief, uncertainty, or memory before he can act responsibly. Maturity is not presented as perfect internal certainty. It is presented as the ability to stop allowing fear and shame to make every important decision. That is why the final image of continuity matters. The story returns to a structure resembling the beginning, but the meaning has changed. At the start, continuity seemed automatic. One generation would succeed another because that was the established order. At the end, continuity has survived rupture, manipulation, exile, and failure. It no longer looks inevitable. It looks maintained. That is the final reframe of The Lion King. The film begins by asking us to see Simba from the position of inheritance. He belongs at the center because everyone around him treats that place as his future. The ending asks us to see him from the position of responsibility. He stands at the center only after understanding that the role matters because of what it demands beyond himself. Privilege explains where Simba starts. Choice explains who he becomes. And once that distinction is visible, the story's most familiar image changes meaning. Pride Rock is no longer simply the place Simba was born to occupy. It is the place he finally understands he has to answer for. The performances in The Lion King do more than give personality to familiar characters. They control how close the audience is allowed to move toward each character's emotional position. And that distance becomes especially important because the story depends on unequal access to fear, authority, guilt, and ambition. Simba's vocal performance changes noticeably across the film's two major stages of life. The younger Simba is defined by speed, confidence, and a tendency to speak before fully understanding what he is entering. His enthusiasm makes his assumptions about kingship feel emotionally believable. We hear a child enjoying the idea of importance rather than someone carefully considering the responsibilities attached to it. That performance protects Simba from premature judgment. His confidence can be reckless, but it rarely feels calculated. The energy of the delivery keeps us aligned with curiosity rather than arrogance. Even when Simba wants to prove himself, the performance reminds us that he is experimenting with an identity whose consequences remain abstract. Mufasa is approached differently. James Earl Jones gives the character authority through control rather than constant intensity. The steadiness of the voice helps create the impression that Mufasa does not need to fight for the audience's attention. His authority already exists before he speaks, and the performance reinforces that stability by avoiding unnecessary urgency. This affects Simba's scenes with him. When Simba becomes excited or uncertain, Mufasa's measured delivery creates contrast. The father appears to occupy a wider emotional perspective than the son. Simba responds to the immediate moment. Mufasa tends to respond as though he can see the responsibility surrounding that moment. The performance therefore creates distance without emotional coldness. Scar works through almost the opposite strategy. Jeremy Irons gives him a controlled, dry quality that makes intelligence visible while keeping sincerity uncertain. Scar often appears to be observing other characters rather than meeting them emotionally on equal terms. His pauses and shifts in emphasis encourage the audience to hear intention beneath surface politeness. That creates suspicion before every motive needs to be explained directly. The film does not ask us to become emotionally intimate with Scar's resentment. Instead, the performance keeps us near enough to understand his frustration and far enough to notice how frequently he converts relationships into opportunities for control. Adult Simba requires another adjustment in distance. Matthew Broderick's performance presents a character who can sound relaxed when his life remains safely separated from the past. Around Timon and Pumbaa, Simba's delivery fits the ease of the environment he has chosen. The important change arrives when familiar responsibilities return. Then the confidence becomes less stable. Hesitation, defensiveness, and changes in rhythm reveal that Simba's apparent peace has limits. The performance gives us evidence of internal conflict without turning every thought into an explanation. We can hear when a subject is becoming dangerous to him before he openly admits why. Nala's performance helps challenge that emotional shelter. Moira Kelly gives adult Nala enough warmth for the reunion with Simba to feel genuine, but her urgency prevents the relationship from becoming purely nostalgic. She carries information from a world Simba has not been seeing. When that information enters their conversations, affection and disagreement are allowed to exist together. This changes audience alignment. Because Simba remains the protagonist, it would be easy for the film to let his reluctance dominate every emotional exchange. Nala's performance resists that imbalance. Her concern gives the Pride Lands a human weight that Simba's distant knowledge cannot provide on its own. Timon and Pumbaa create another useful form of alignment. Nathan Lane and Ernie Sabella bring comic energy that makes Simba's adopted life attractive rather than obviously false. That matters because escape has to contain something worth staying for. If the audience regarded this period only as a mistake, Simba's hesitation about returning would lose complexity. Their warmth shows that the problem is not the friendship Simba formed. The problem is the boundary he built around what those friendships allowed him to avoid. Across these performances, emotional access is carefully distributed. Mufasa receives dignity and warmth. Scar receives charisma, but greater distance. Nala receives moral urgency. Timon and Pumbaa receive affection without becoming the final authorities on Simba's identity. Simba receives the largest range. We experience his innocence, fear, relief, defensiveness, and eventual resolve from different distances. The performance does not ask us to approve of every decision. It asks us to remain close enough to understand why those decisions make sense from where Simba is standing. That is the key connection to the film's larger perspective. Simba becomes worthy of responsibility not because the performance suddenly transforms him into an entirely different person, but because the uncertainty we have heard throughout the film finally coexists with action. The voice does not need to become fearless. It only needs to stop letting fear define the limits of what Simba is willing to face. The image and sound design of The Lion King repeatedly decide how much of the world Simba is allowed to understand at any given moment. The film often makes physical space feel like knowledge. Open environments suggest access and belonging, while enclosed or obscured spaces tend to appear when Simba's confidence exceeds what he actually knows. Pride Rock is the clearest example. At the beginning, it gives the kingdom a visual center. The elevation creates authority, but it also creates visibility. From that position, the surrounding land appears coherent and connected. Simba is introduced to a world that seems capable of being understood from above. That apparent clarity is part of his privilege. He begins life close to the center of a system whose structure has already been explained to him. The landscape feels stable because his relationship to it is stable. Scar's spaces create a different kind of access. They are more enclosed and more separated from the openness associated with Mufasa's rule. The effect is not simply to code one character as dark and another as good. More importantly, those spaces emphasize Scar's position as someone looking at the established order from outside its emotional center. His scenes frequently feel more private. That privacy gives him informational advantages. Plans can exist in spaces Simba does not see. The audience may receive access to them, but Simba remains excluded. The difference creates tension through geography. Simba moves through the kingdom believing it is largely transparent. The audience has already been shown that important things are happening beyond his field of knowledge. The gorge pushes that principle much further. Its scale overwhelms Simba's ability to control what is happening around him. The environment becomes difficult to read because movement, sound, and danger arrive faster than his understanding can organize them. Here, sound becomes especially important. Noise does not simply make the sequence intense. It limits access. Simba cannot calmly interpret the situation because the sonic environment places him inside confusion. The audience understands more because the film has already provided information outside his perspective. But emotionally, we are positioned close to his fear. That separation between knowledge and experience is central to the film. We may understand the danger better than Simba does, while still feeling the event primarily through his vulnerability. Music frequently works in the opposite direction. During Simba's more carefree periods, musical sequences expand his experience. Rhythm, movement, and collective performance make confidence feel contagious. The image and sound combine to place the viewer inside the pleasure of the moment before asking us to evaluate its limitations. That is particularly important during Simba's life with Timon and Pumbaa. The relaxed environment and comic musical energy make his escape emotionally attractive. The film does not surround his period with constant signs that Simba is living incorrectly. Instead, the film gives his new life genuine warmth. We need to feel why he stays. If the sound and image treated exile only as emptiness, then his later reluctance to return would have little emotional credibility. The film instead creates access to comfort while withholding the larger consequences. That changes when Nala reconnects Simba with the Pride Lands. Once information from home enters his sheltered environment, the meaning of its comfort shifts. The same space that once suggested freedom begins to reveal its distance from responsibility. Sound participates in that recontextualization. Lighter rhythms give way to more reflective passages when Simba can no longer keep the past entirely outside his present. Silence and reduced comic energy create room for hesitation. The absence of constant noise becomes a form of access. We begin listening for what Simba is unwilling to say. The return to the Pride Lands produces another visual reframe. The kingdom that once appeared expansive and secure now feels damaged by the consequences of Scar's rule. The film uses environmental change to make political failure immediately legible. That simplification is deliberate. The audience does not need an extensive explanation of policy or governance. The altered landscape allows us to experience the result of leadership to the physical world. Most importantly, the image changes the meaning of home. For the young Simba, the Pride Lands represented inheritance. For the returning Simba, they represent responsibility. The same geography now confronts him with what distance has allowed him not to see. This is where image and sound become part of the film's perspective rather than decoration around it. They control whether the world feels available, hidden, safe, overwhelming, playful, or demanding. Simba's understanding changes because his emotional access changes. And by the final act, he is no longer looking at the Pride Lands from the protected height of someone who assumes they belong to him. He is looking at a damaged world that asks what he is prepared to do for it. The perspective of the Lion King is effective because it keeps Simba at the emotional center, while gradually widening what the audience understands around him. But that same structure also creates limitations. The film is so committed to making Simba's inner journey legible that other parts of the kingdom can feel simplified whenever they fall outside his experience. The clearest example is the Pride Lands under Scar. We understand that conditions have deteriorated, and the film communicates that change efficiently through environment, mood, and the behavior of the characters who remain. What we receive less of is the lived perspective of those who endured that decline while Simba was gone. Nala carries some of that experience back to him, but even her viewpoint is largely used to redirect Simba's story. That creates an imbalance. The kingdom matters deeply, yet much of its suffering becomes meaningful because of what it asks Simba to do. Other characters have stakes of their own, but the film rarely pauses long enough to let those stakes reorganize the story independently. This does not make the perspective incoherent. It makes it narrow. The choice keeps the film emotionally focused, but it also means that the political consequences of Scar's rule are compressed into a highly readable contrast between order and decline. The visual transformation of the Pride Lands is immediate and effective, yet it leaves little room for complexity inside that change. Scar's perspective is also limited by the film's need for clarity. His resentment, intelligence, and desire for status are established strongly, but he is kept at a distance that prevents the audience from seeing much beyond ambition and grievance. This works dramatically because he remains threatening and legible. It also makes the moral contrast easier than the film's treatment of Simba. Simba is allowed contradiction. Scar is allowed style, calculation, and frustration, but much less vulnerability or ambiguity. That difference can make the final opposition feel simpler than the middle of the film, where Simba's guilt, avoidance, and responsibility are handled with greater psychological nuance. There is another break in perspective when the film connects leadership so directly to the condition of the land. As visual storytelling, the idea is powerful because it turns governance into something immediately visible. As analysis, however, it can also make responsibility appear almost too centralized. The kingdom's problems become closely attached to the identity of the ruler, while broader systems, collective agency, and the responsibilities of other characters receive less attention. That simplification suits the fable-like structure, but it narrows the range of possible interpretations. The ending, therefore, resolves the emotional argument more fully than the social one. Simba's transformation is clear. He moves from inherited certainty, through guilt and avoidance, toward chosen responsibility. The kingdom's recovery is treated more symbolically. For a film that asks us to think seriously about what authority demands, this is where the perspective becomes least developed. The strength and weakness come from the same decision. By keeping Simba's experience dominant, the Lion King gains emotional clarity, strong alignment, and a clean transformation in how the audience sees him. But the tighter that focus becomes, the more other perspectives risk becoming evidence inside Simba's journey rather than complete positions of their own. What finally remains after the Lion King has moved through inheritance, exile, deception, and return is a different understanding of what it means to belong at the center of a story. Simba's importance is never erased. He is still Mufasa's son, still the rightful heir, and still the character around whom the film organizes its emotional axis. But by the end, those facts no longer seem sufficient on their own. Birth explains why the kingdom expected something from him. It does not explain why he should be trusted with that expectation. The more important change is that Simba eventually accepts a relationship with the Pride Lands that is no longer based on entitlement. He returns knowing that leadership includes consequences he cannot control, memories he cannot undo, and obligations that exist beyond his own comfort. That makes the final position stronger than the opening one because the role has stopped functioning as a reward. It has become a responsibility. This is where the film's central contrast reaches its clearest resolution. Inherited privilege gives Simba access to a future, but chosen responsibility gives that future meaning. The film's craft supports that shift by changing how we experience Simba inside the world. Early images place him within an order that already confirms his significance. Later images make him confront what that order looks like when leadership fails. Performance does something similar. Youthful certainty becomes adult hesitation, and hesitation eventually gives way not to complete fearlessness but to action. That is an important distinction. The film does not need Simba to become invulnerable in order to make his return convincing. It needs him to stop treating vulnerability as proof that he should remain absent. At the same time, the Lion King's perspective remains narrower than its world. Nala, the Pride Lands, and even Scar are often understood primarily through the effect they have on Simba's development. The story gains clarity from that focus, but it sacrifices some complexity in the process. That limitation is a major reason my rating remains 6/10. The film is structurally confident and exceptionally clear about how it wants us to feel Simba's movement from protected certainty toward responsibility. But its strongest ideas are sometimes simplified by the fable-like moral design surrounding them. Viewers who value direct emotional storytelling, strong character alignment, and visual storytelling that makes shifts in responsibility easy to feel may still find a great deal to appreciate here. The lasting perspective is not simply that Simba was always meant to be king. It is that the position only becomes meaningful once he understands that being given a place and becoming capable of answering for it are two very different things. The Lion King ultimately leaves us with a distinction that is easy to miss when the story is remembered only as a tale about a prince returning home. Simba begins with a place already waiting for him. He ends by understanding that a place of importance means very little unless he is willing to accept what it asks of him. That shift is what gives the film its lasting perspective. The Pride Lands first appear as an inheritance, something Simba expects to receive because of who he is. By the conclusion, they have become a responsibility, something he chooses to answer for despite everything that made escape easier. The film may simplify some of the world surrounding Simba, but its clearest idea remains effective. Identity is not completed by being told where we belong. It is shaped by what we decide to do once belonging carries consequences. So when you think about Simba's return, which matters more to you, reclaiming the position that was always his, or finally choosing to become responsible for what that position represents, share your interpretation in the comments. If you enjoy movie analysis built around perspective, audience alignment, and the way films change what we believe as they unfold, subscribe to Film Perspective Media. Thanks for watching and for taking one last look at The Lion King from a different position.